Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Just a second. Where have we go? Okay, all right. So I'm now rooted to the lectern for the moment. So let's go to the Waddle page and take a look at some class administration. So I really encourage everybody, whenever you have questions, to visit the Waddle website where you have the class forum. And so you will see that I respond to every single question on there. So every day I will come and check the Waddle forum and look for questions, and I will post any of the questions that you email me that I found to be of common interest to everybody and post it on here. So in here, there was a really good question about differences in quotation conventions that you see perhaps in your CFA exams or in your previous experiences with different kind of textbooks. So in previous offerings for this course, I used a different textbook. And in that textbook, the convention used was the same as in the CFA convention. But that was different from what the most of the market uses, all of these quotations, which you will see on Bloomberg. So for example, if you go on to Bloomberg and look for currency quotations, you will find that all of the quotations that is used in the marketplace in most of the major news media outlets follow the same convention as what we use in the class right now. But I just want to warn you that there are differences in conventions, and this leads very well into my next highlight on Waddle, which is on something that I uploaded last night in the practice and assessment section. So I have posted some sample past exams. These are past exams this semester, including the final exams, that are written by me in the previous offerings. So I really want to draw your attention to the disclaimers, right? Because every offering of this course, I will actually revamp the material that we cover. Because international finance is so fast changing, it doesn't make any sense to stick with the same material after a year's time. Right? So I will have very different focus on even the same material. And so the items that I'm going to be testing on are going to be different year to year. However, these sample exams provide an example of the kind of style of questions that I'm going to ask. The mixture of calculation questions as well as theoretical questions. And then the sample answer key here will tell you very clearly what I look for when I'm doing the marking. So I provide the sample key here and what each point is worth. Maybe not this one, because this is the final exam. So in the final exam, I'm not going to provide the solution key, but for both of the mid-semester exams, I provided the very detailed solution key. So for example, if you look at this sample final, I have all of the working out, and the same as the other one. This one is more advanced. I type it up. Right, so for this one, there are a mixture of multiple choice questions, theoretical questions, short answer questions, as well as calculation questions. Right, so you will be able to see the kind of questions that I ask in these kind of assessments and the style. But as I mentioned, the questions and the emphasis on each of these topics will be quite different. So you will probably see topics in these past exams that we're not going to cover in the semester. So when you see them, please do not panic, right? And the case for studying well in this course, I always feel, as I said to one of your classmates at the end of the last class, if everybody is able to do well, and everybody in the course deserves an HD, I'm willing to make the case to our school. In all of my years of teaching, both in Toronto and here, I have never, ever downgraded or downscaled all of your marks. I always kept them or increased them. Right? So there should not be any concern that if you actually deserve an HD, I'm not going to give you an HD. That is not the case. And the level of HDs, distinctions, credits, passes in this course is very comparable to the average FINM courses. So after the mid-semester exams, I'm going to provide you with a breakdown of the grade. And you will see, it just happens in all of my courses that all the grade distributions work out really, really well. So there are about roughly 15% in the HD category, 20% and 25% in the next, and so on. If I do not have to fail you, I will not. I always try very hard to not fail people. So please try to help me to help you. It doesn't give me any satisfaction to fail any of you. Trust me. All right? But it gives me great satisfaction if you're able to do really well in this course and do the best that you can. All right? Any questions? Okay, so also to reiterate on the course structure, we are going to be having 3 hours of lecture here. So your only point of contact is me, fortunately and unfortunately. So unfortunate part, you don't have more people to contact, but fortunately, I work really, really hard to make sure your questions are answered, and your questions are answered in the best possible way. Right? You're not going to be misdirected. I'm going to be the person to provide marking scheme. So everything that I say, I will be able to remember and incorporate. So you shouldn't have to worry about any inconsistencies, right? So, and then you will see, as we go on the class, I'm going to be working out different problems with you, so you don't have to worry about not enough exercise. And I'm going to be posting problem sets model that you can work on, and you are always welcome to come to my consultations. So there shouldn't be any concern there, hopefully. Questions? All good. Thank you. And the last thing that I really want to emphasize here is that the calculation questions involving any quotes in these past exams would be of a different convention from what we're using this semester, right? Because I have used a different textbook. So please do not get confused and do not get hung up on the calculation questions you see on the sample exams. That is most important. All right, so let's start on today's class. So let's do a bit of recap from the previous lecture. So in the previous lecture, we talked about an overview into the international financial market. Essentially, why we talked about why would firms want to go global, some of the advantages and disadvantages, or some of the advantages of firms wanting to go global. Comparative advantage, right? You may want, one country may be better at producing certain products, and so you might want to specialize in certain products and trade with other countries. What are some of the other reasons that firms may want to go global? In a way, I feel that it's nice that you're all sitting in really nice cushioned seats, but in the other hand, I think you're further away from me. So. Any other reasons for extended business, right? So in the cases of Starbucks and in the cases of IKEA, exactly, they want to open up subsidiaries and stores worldwide in order to grab onto a larger market share, right? So these are some of the advantages of going global, and comes with it would be some disadvantages, which is in the form of exchange rate risk, yes? Political risks, tax problems, and so on, right? So we're going to be spending this course thinking about how firms are able to get the best advantages out of expanding overseas, and also how to manage the potential risks that comes with it. So we talked about why we need the foreign exchange market. So it's just the same as in banks and financial institutions that we see day to day within any country. In order to buy and sell food, I'm hungry, goods. In order to buy and sell goods and services, you need to have capital and money to finance the purchases, right? So then you need the foreign exchange market in order to finance your foreign currency needs, to buy and sell goods and services and move capital around different countries. We talked about market organizations, especially the retail sector of the foreign exchange market and the interbank or the wholesale sector of the foreign exchange market. The most important and prominent FX center is where? London, right? UK. And the trading hours in centers around the world is almost 24/7. There's just a very short period of 5 hours in the world when all of the trading centers in every country are closed down at the same time. So there's only 5 hours. We talked about the major types of currencies that are being traded. So there are always major pairs. And then we talked about different types of transactions. And then we moved on to talking about different types of quotations, direct quotations versus indirect quotations. So what is a direct quotation? If I am in a domestic country, for a direct quotation, where does the domestic currency go? in the denominator or the numerator? So if it is a direct quote, then it would be, so if we're talking about Australian dollar, and we want a direct quote on Australian dollar against any other currency, where do we see Australian dollar? In the bottom or at the top? Bottom, right? So it's at the bottom. So that's how we think about this. And then we talked about European terms and American terms. So if we're seeing American term quote, then it is a quote with respect to the US dollar. So would the US dollar go at the bottom or the top? Bottom, right? So that's how you distinguish between American terms versus European terms. And we need to know this because these are used so often in the FX market and in the course. So let's try to remember these. And then we talked about how we see quotations in terms of the big figures and the small figures, the pips, because most of our foreign currency notations are quoted in how many decimal points? 4, right? So we're looking at the 4 decimal points. So which part is the big figure? The first 3, right? Oops, sorry. So, and the small figure or the pips are the last two digits. And then we have the cross rates. What are cross rates? Any quotations that involve a pair of foreign currency that non-US currencies, precisely. So any currency pairs that does not involve the US dollar is called the cross rate. And we usually derive the cross rate from all the major quotations that involve US dollars. Because essentially every FX trader in the world will carry some inventory of US dollar. And so you will often see prices quoted of one currency against the US dollar. And if you are trying to get a currency quotation for currency A versus currency B that does not involve the US dollar, we usually have to work it out through the US dollar, which we are going to have an example of. And then we talked about the bid prices, the ask prices, and the midpoint quotations. So in these, the key idea with bid and ask are buy low, sell high. Whenever you go to the bank, you get less. Whenever you go to the bank to get something, you have to pay more, right? You get less from the bank, but you have to pay more to the bank in order to, what do we call this? The difference. Spread, right? The bid-ask spread. And the bid-ask spread is to compensate for the bank's what? Transaction cost, right? Its inventory carrying cost, and so on, right? And the bank is there to make money. The financial intermediaries have to exist to make money. It's not non-profit. All right, so let's get into some questions. So we have 2 questions here. The first one is an extension of a question that we worked out from last class. And one of your classmates asked me this question: what about when there are bid-ask spreads, when we are trying to work out cross rates? So now I have a question on working out cross rates when you have bid-ask spreads. And then the second question involves looking at the bid-ask quotes by a financial intermediation and work out what kind of direction or implied idea that this trader is probably trying to trade. So let's get ahead with it. So in the previous slide, what you saw here are something that you haven't seen before. So you see the terminologies Swissy and Aussie. Any guess at what they might mean? Pardon? Australian dollars. Definitely the first one, the second one involves some Australian dollars, right? And the first one, Swiss franc, right? So there must be something that involves both of these currencies. And indeed, as I mentioned last class, in finance, people love jargons or nicknames. And so these are some of the terms that we will often see whenever we listen to news programs that talk about foreign exchange. So in this case, a lot of the traders, usually the traders that trade these currencies every single day, like to refer to currencies by their nicknames or jargons rather than using the symbols, just to make it fun, right? Just like if you are trading so much with a currency, it's almost like a friend to you. And so sometimes you will refer to your friends as by their nickname, not their full name. So these are similar to this. So the really common major pairs are the Australian and the US dollar pair. And so this pair is commonly referred to as Aussie. The US dollar versus the Swiss franc are referred to as Swissy. I didn't come up with these terms, but and the Euro and the Japanese pair are referred to as Yapi. So the spelling are slightly different, but the pronunciation are exactly the same. And the Great British Pound and the Japanese Yen pair are referred to as Yapi or Gopher. But the last term of Gopher here could also refer to the US dollar Japanese Yen pair. So Gopher is this land rodent that you see that burrows in North America. Why do we use Gopher to refer to these pairs? Apparently, it's because of the really intense volatilities between these currency pairs. So you have a rodent that goes everywhere, and then it symbolizes the volatility. Whether or not you buy that, I don't know. But that's what it's used for. So these nicknames are basically ideas where you would simplify the currency pair and just playing on two words to make it shorter. And then you have the really famous British pound and the US dollar pair, which is really often referred to as the cable. So there is a historical origin for this because in the past, when the Great British Pound and US dollars are being traded, the quotations are often transmitted on the telecommunications channel that lies between London and New York, right? So that's why they actually refer to it as cable. And then later on, Euro came onto the scene, and Euro and USD is referred to as fiber. And this is seen as an upgrade from the telecommunications cable that are used to refer to the Great British Pound. And then we have the Euro and the Great British Pound being referred to as channel. So this is a portmanteau of channel tunnel, which is the English channel that connects southern England with northern France across the English Channel, right? So that's some historical and geographical origins towards these. And then you will have New Zealand dollar versus the US dollar. That's often called Kiwis, right? Because you have New Zealand often being referred to as Kiwi. So that's what the bird looked like. And then you have the US dollar Canadian pair referred to as the loonie. So the $1 coin in Canada is also called the loonie, which is this little waterfowl that leaves lots of poo droppings everywhere. And then you have the US dollar Japanese yen pair that is referred to as the ninja or sometimes as the King Kong, right? So you have a whole bunch of this. I loved playing the Fruit Ninja at one time. It was very distressing. Very nice. All right, so currency pair nicknames make it easy for foreign exchange traders to refer to any pair very easily and quickly. However, you do not have to memorize these nicknames for the purpose of this course. However, if you actually know them, it will really help you to understand the foreign exchange news and any articles because, as I said, they love using jargons. So if you see the ninja is rising, what does it mean? If you see on a FX news article that says the ninja is rising, what does it say about the Japanese yen? Appreciating, right? Because we're talking about the Japanese yen and the US dollar pair. Very well, and if you're able to understand them and use them properly in an interview, I'm sure that's going to make you a better candidate than everybody else. All right, so my job here is to try to let you know of all the terms and help you to do better, whether it is in getting a job or to find a postgraduate degree, or like in this case, doctoral degree. All right, so let's get back to the first question. So we have a bank here, our very own bank, FINM that is quoting the following foreign exchange rates, the Swissy and the Aussie. And there is an Australian firm, DSQ, that asks the bank for an indirect quote against the Swiss franc. Which cross rate would the bank quote? All right, so let's take a minute to take in this question. So we just talked about the Swissy. So that is the US dollar Swiss franc pair. And then we talked about the Aussie. So typically, when we see the US dollar and the Australian dollar pair, should we see it in the first form or the second form? First form, right? Exactly, so it's convention. So by convention, euro, Great British pound, Australian dollar, New Zealand dollars are always quoted in American terms, while the rest of the currencies are quoted in European terms. Right, second, let's look at the question. We are trying to get an indirect quote against the Swiss franc for an Australian firm. So in this case, we want an indirect quote. We want to make sure that the top and the bottom, the base currencies and the price currencies are correct. So which one is it that we are trying to find? The first one or the second one? The first one, right? We just revisited that. Very good. So the price of the domestic currency in foreign currency units. So if we're looking at an indirect quote, we're looking at the first one because the Australian dollar is our domestic currency. Now, so we start to deal with the bid-ask quotes. Which ones should be used in the process? So in this case, we always remember the rip-off rule, or the one that I just told you. You get less from the bank, and you have to pay more to the bank in order to make any transactions. So that guides how we go on to do the rest of the question. Okay, so the bid for the Australian dollar and the Swiss franc pair should be as small as possible. What does this mean? This means that you're willing, what does the bid for this mean from your perspective? You're willing to sell one Australian dollar for a certain amount of Swiss franc, right? In order to get a certain amount of Swiss franc. So in this case, what you get back for selling the one Australian dollar should be as small as possible because you know you're getting less from the bank. And so you're going to perform this operation. What does this do? I'm going to do it on the next slide. So just hang on with me here. So in this case, the bid for the pair should give you as less currency back as possible, as less Swiss franc back as possible. Whereas the ask, you are trying to buy $1 Australian for a certain amount of Swiss franc. So in this case, because of the rip-off rule, you need to pay as much to the bank as possible, right? So you're going to use the asks. So in the end, this worked out to be that the bank is going to quote the cross rate that we see here. All right, so it's all very good when we're talking about this in class. But suppose that you are in an exam or you are just sitting there not thinking about lecture notes. How are we going to work this out? Let's work it out from first principles. All right, so let's take a look at from your perspective. So this is everything from your perspective. From your perspective, what does the big quote do for the first one? US dollar, CHF, Swiss franc. So if we're looking at the bid price, so if we work from first principles, this means that we're willing to sell $1 or the bank is asking you to sell $1 in order to get how much Swiss franc? Which number should it be? This one or this one? The first one or the second one? So this is the bid, the definition of the bid price when we're looking at any quotes. The first one, right? So you're getting less because you're trying to sell $1 and you get the lesser quote. So you're getting the 1.0079 Swiss franc. So that is the interpretation of the bid price for this quote. Okay, let's do it for the ask. So for the ask here, it tells you that if you want to buy the $1 back, you have to pay some price. What is the price that you pay here? $1.0089, right? Which is the second one, the higher price. So this here basically tells you that, yeah, you're going to get less Swiss franc for $1, but you have to pay more to get it. That's the bid-ask spread that the bank gets as a profit. Okay, let's repeat this for the next pair. So in this pair, what does it do? Okay, this tells you that we're asked to sell $1 Australian to get how much US dollar? Yes, 0.7107 US dollar. And then the ask price means that we need to buy back exactly the Australian dollars with the higher quote, right? You have to pay more in order to get that $1 Australian back. Is it very clear at this point? Yeah? Because once we get this point across, then every other calculation question will be really easy for you, because that's the basic, that's just as difficult as it gets in terms of currency conversion. All right, very good. So next, we're trying to get the Australian Swiss franc indirect quote. So essentially, we will have to also provide a bid quote as well as an ask quote as well. So what does the bid quote mean? What's the interpretation of the bid quote in this currency pair? Sell 1 AUD to get a question amount of CHF, and the ask price means buy 1 AUD with a question amount of the Swiss franc. And to check your answers, you need to always see that it's less than that, right? The bid should always be less than the ask. Okay. All right, so how do we get the bid? To get the bid rate, the operations are essentially the following. You're trying to sell Australian dollars in order to get Swiss franc, right? At the end of it, you're going to get Swiss francs. So now, remember, this is now a cross rate. And with a cross rate, we usually get the prices out of the prices against the US dollar first. So this illustrates what I mean by that. So in this case, the underlying operations in this conversion is essentially that you're going to sell Australian dollar to get US dollar, right? Which you already have a rate here. And then you're going to convert the US dollar into the Swiss franc, which we also have the prices for. Yeah? Is it clear? Yeah? Are we good? Let's get some action out here. It's only 3 o'clock. You'll be all asleep by 6 o'clock. We're all good here. This is really important stuff. You're going to be tested on this on the midterm, I promise. Pardon? There's a mid-semester. Yeah, mid-semester. Oh, okay, and the final. How's that? Now you have challenged me. This is very important. Do we get this? Yeah? Okay. So getting a cross rate, it's essentially like you're trying to convert between the different currencies, but using the US dollar as the intermediary. All right? So that's how we always get the cross rates. All good? Yes, great. Okay. So now, remember the key to the bid price. You're always going to get less. So let's take a look at this rate here. If you're going to sell Australian dollar into US dollar, we're getting less, right? So which rate should we use out of this one? The first one, right? Because again, you're getting less. So you're getting the bid rate. For the second operation, again, you're using the first one, the bid price, because that guarantees you're getting the less rate, right? So again, you're using the bid price. And then what do we eventually want to get? We want to eventually get a rate in this form. Okay, so we are working out with the AUD and the US dollar rate. And we're also working with the US dollar and the Swiss franc rate in order to get this format that we want, this quotation that we want. So my question to you here is, should it be a multiply or a division here? Multiply, right? So you multiply this, and then that will guarantee that these two are going to cancel out in order to leave you with AUD at the top and CHF at the bottom. All right, so we are almost there. We're almost there. So this rate that we are going to use is the bit rate, which is 0.7107, multiplied by the bit rate that we use here as well, 1.0079. So that is going to give you the same answer as the slide before. Can somebody remind me what the previous answer was? Sorry. 63. Okay. 0.781. Thank you. Okay. So that's how we got this as the rate. So that means in order to sell 1 Australian dollar to the bank, you're going to get 0.7163 Swiss franc back. All right, so the key idea here is you're going to get less. Let's do the same for the ask. So in doing the ask, what you're trying to do is to buy Australian dollar with Swiss franc. So what you essentially do is to start with Swiss franc or Australian dollar. Swiss franc, right? So we're starting with Swiss franc first. Convert it into US dollar, and then convert it into Australian dollar. So in this case, we have to pay more. So in order to get US dollar, we have to pay more amounts of Swiss franc. So which of these two should we be using? The first or the second? Second, right? In order to get 1 US dollar, we have to pay more Swiss franc. So we're going to use the ask. What about the next operation? We have to pay more US dollars in order to get 1 Australian dollar. So is it the bid or the ask? The ask. Again, the higher rate. So what it ends up to be here is going to be, again, we want something in terms of AUD over CHF. And what we have here is the US dollar CHF, and then the AUD rate over US dollar here. So how do we multiply or divide here? Multiply, right? So again, we're going to multiply in order to have the cancellation of the US dollar terms to end up with this term. So what we're going to do is, sorry that I have to move it over here, use 1.1 Okay. 1.0089 multiplied by 0.7112. And that should give you the ask price in the previous slide, which is, thank you, 0.7175. right? So you check, is the bid price less than the ask price? Indeed, that is the case. And the entire underlying operation is also explained out there. All right? So in any time that you're confused about whether to use the bid quote or the ask quote, you can go through this operation, go back to the first principles, and think about what the bid and the ask quotes mean, and then work it out. All good? Great. Excellent. Okay, let's move on to the next question. So now we have a trader that specializes in the US dollar and the Canadian dollar pair. Now the trader is currently quoting a small figure bid ask of 35 against 40, when the rest of the market is trading the same pair in terms of 36.41. What is implied by the trader's beliefs by his prices? So that's the price that we see here. So let's take a look at this price. So suppose I am a customer like every one of you. I see these quotes. What does it mean here? So in order to buy $1 US, if I go to this trader, I have to pay 1.3235 Canadian dollars. But if I sell $1 US, I pay sort of this rate. So if we want to sell $1 US into Canadian dollar, would you go to the trader or would you go to the rest of the market? The rest of the market, right? Because for every US dollar that we sell, we get a slightly higher rate. Whereas if I want to buy US dollar, where would I want to go? The trader, right? Because I pay slightly less than the rest of the market. So overall, what is this trader trying to do? This trader is paying less per US dollar sold, and it's paying more per US dollar bought. What is the trader trying to do? Yes, precisely. What the trader is essentially doing is trying to collect more Canadian dollars. So, right? So this actually summarizes what we just did. The trader actually wants to buy US dollar with less Canadian dollar than the rest of the market. So any of us rational customers will want to go to the rest of the market to do it. So we're not going to sell him or her US dollar. But they're willing to sell US dollar for less Canadian dollars than the rest of the market. So if we have Canadian dollars, we're going to go to the person to pay him Canadian dollar in order to buy the US dollar. So in essence, this trader is trying to accumulate his Canadian dollar inventory. Why would somebody want to increase their holding of a currency? Precisely. Right? You will want to increase your holding of something because you think the price is going to increase. In this case, it's Canadian dollars. In other cases, it can be gold. It can be silver. It can be, I think, Red Delicious apples are really expensive and out of the market right now, so I will want to accumulate on Red Delicious apples. Right? So it's the same for any goods and commodities. Right? If it is more expensive, you think that it's going to be more expensive, you want to hold on to it. So precisely what we think this trader might think is that they think that the Canadian dollar is going to be worth more relative to the US dollar, to be worth more. So in other words, he believes the Canadian dollar is going to appreciate, like your colleague mentioned. And otherwise, even if he doesn't have any directional view, it could be that he feels that the US dollar that he holds is just a little too much, and so he wants to decrease his accumulation of the US dollar. So both ways would work. But I would look for both answers if this was an answer on the semester or the final exam, right? Because I feel that for an 8,000 level course after you graduate from a master's degree, it is not about every single thing that you learn in this class, every detail. You probably is going to return that all to me after the final exam, right? That is often the case. But what I want you to really get a hang out of this is the way that we take a problem and think about how to solve it. How to, step by step, think about what kind of steps that we have to take in order to resolve a problem. That is what makes you a really valuable employee and person out there. So that is what I want you to get ultimately from this course. All right. Very good. Okay, so now we have had the practice. Let's try to make sure that we actually got it. So we have two questions here. Your boss in Sydney asked you to provide an indirect quote for the CLP against the Australian dollar. Which quote would you provide? What is the CLP? What is the CLP? It's one of the currency denominations that one of our classmates for sure will have it. Chilean peso, right? So let's look at this. Oh, wow, this is totally out of whack. So just hold on. I need to get out, sorry. Okay, and then it moves to the top. Okay. It's all right, let's do it from here. That tells you that we should always be prepared for any contingencies. All right, let's do this. So, your boss in Sydney asked you to provide an indirect quote for the Chilean peso against Australian dollar. Which quote would you provide? So this is a direct test on whether or not you got the indirect quote correct. So you are in Sydney, so the Australian dollar is your domestic currency. So if we are looking at an indirect quote, oh dear. I like diversity, but in an exam, probably diversity is not that good when it comes to multiple choices. So do we agree with the majority or do we agree with the 23%? The majority, right? So if we're actually in an exam or actually on the street, what you're going to do is to do the bottom quote, right? And right now, I just got that off Bloomberg today, so that is the correct quote for the Chilean peso against the Australian dollar. Okay, very good. So let me get out before, well, everybody is, most of you are getting the question correct. Next, Okay, so what you see in the news article is that the Aussie got aggressively sold off into intensifying risk off trades. So you will often see headlines like that when you're listening to Bloomberg or looking at articles. So what is happening to the Australian US dollar pair, and what is the market sentiment on the Australian dollar? First, the market is worried about US dollar volatility and it's buying into the Australian dollar. So the demand for Australian dollar is increasing. That increases the price of the Australian dollar relative to the US dollar. And then we have the second answer, which I think most of you have settled on, which is, or not. The Australian US dollar experienced a sharp decline as the market is concerned over economic outlook for the Asia-Pacific region. So lots of you have chosen the bottom. So if we are in an exam, or if you are out on the street working, then the second version would be what you would give to your clients. All right, so all good? Very good. So let's take a short break before we come back and start on the next topic. 5 minutes. And thank you for the quiz.
I have a quick question, very confusing me.
Sure.
Is that, look at this highline sentence. Does it call is difficult from the one, different from the one we
Oh, yes. So this is like, so that's the CFA?
Yeah.
So I have talked about this in the course form. Slow. So basically what you see is that the CFA has a different convention to what we use in the market and in this course. So if you actually go to, so basically you're going to see that we have a different convention.
Yeah.
So the CFA uses one convention, but the rest of the market.
So both one are correct. Both are correct.
Both ones are correct. If you are in the CFA, do the CFA convention. But in the market, when you're working, it's our convention.
So that's really confused. I always have to transfer my mind. Okay, so during this class, we have to use those you taught us.
And that's the same as the market convention. So if you actually go to Bloomberg and so on, right?
Yeah, I've searched the website.
Right, so if you actually go on to Bloomberg, then basically what you're going to see is the one that we use in class. And that's why I decided to change my convention. Because I used to do the same convention as CFA convention, because the previous textbook did it. But then I just find it confusing for the students if they have to go out in the market. And so I decided.
I understand. Thank you.
That indirect really against Australian dollars. The indirect cost is for the Chilean peso or for
Oh, the key idea there is because your boss in Sydney. So the key idea is that, right? Because so that's why it's really important that you look at that it's your boss in Sydney.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I don't know the expression of that. So the indirect quote of CHF against Australian dollars. Okay, you like identify which indirect quote that they refer to.
It's to determine which is the domestic currency.
Yeah.
So the domestic currency here would be your, because your boss is in Sydney, right? So from the boss's perspective, the Australian dollar is
So
the
you can
domestic
only
currency.
infer from the previous sentences, not from the.
No.
Well, it doesn't really matter to identify, because we just have two currencies here. One is the Chilean, the other is.
You can only find.
You have to, it's all in the same sentence, right? So you have to get everything from that same sentence. Yeah, and that is what you, it's the best to develop, to just get everything from, and not everything is going to be said, hey, you are in Australia, this is the domestic currency, what is your quote? Because in real world, you don't get that, right? And so what I'm trying to do is to help you to start thinking about how do we determine the things precisely. Yeah, because I help students in their internship, right? And then in the internship, whenever the people, your supervisors want to do something, they give you a very vague word. They're not going to tell you that in Australia, we're in here, so we're going to treat this as our. Yeah, so in this one, the idea because your boss is. If I then say your boss is in Chile, then is that clear for you? Okay. Actually, maybe later. Thanks. No, it did not have any sound. So if you actually saw on Waddle, I actually made an announcement for it too, because so there was the recording problem. Basically on that day, for all of the courses, basically there's no sound. Echo. It's not because of our course. It's because this is so new. They just. Yeah, there are ongoing problems. Yeah. All right, so let's try to start again. So, a note again to how important Waddle can be whenever you have a puzzle or a question. So, yes, week 1 recording did not work because the sound was not captured. So that was the case for all of the classes in this room in the afternoon last Wednesday and also last Friday, I believe. So hopefully they have promised that the recording is going to work, but just to hedge the risks, it's always important to take notes, if possible, because you never know about technology, right? And if you have any puzzles or questions, it's potentially already addressed in the course announcements or the Waddle forum. So you can always email me, but if I didn't respond to your email and you are really anxious, then you can go to these places to get your answers. Very good. Okay, so we did the quiz, and to recap on topic 1. So now we are ready to go on to topic 2 for today. So in topic 1, we talked about what is the FX rate and everything involved with converting between different types of quotations. And we talked about quotes very often. A quote is basically the price at which one currency can be exchanged for another currency. So that was on slide 6 of topic 1. And then from your business economics fundamental courses, how are prices determined in a free market? Supply and demand, right? So in a free market, that's what we expect the prices to be set at by forces of supply and demand. So as I said before, foreign exchange or currencies are just like any good and services. So we would expect that supply and demand equally pushes the prices of foreign currencies in terms of each other. But historically, that is not always the case. So in order to get to know how we got to where we are today, it's always worthwhile to think about the history of how things has evolved and understand how are we sitting in where we are today. With paper money, which you cannot convert for a specific good, right? And so on. So we're going to talk about the evolution of the international monetary system, how our exchange rates set, and the balance of payments. So what is the international monetary system? Well, there are definitions for the international monetary system. The first one comes from the IMF. So what does the IMF stand for? So you will see at the bottom, it's the International Monetary Fund. So by IMF's definition, it says it is the system of exchange rates and international payments that enable countries and their citizens to transact with each other. So this is similar to why we say an international financial system should exist, or the market should exist. And if you look at the textbook, it would tell you the definition is the institutional framework within which international payments are made, movements of capital are accommodated, and exchange rates among currencies are determined. So the commonality between these are international payments, movements of capital, and exchange rates. The basic idea of both of these are we are trying to have a system of international payments that helps countries to achieve the best macroeconomic goals. And let's see what has happened. So the IMS, the International Monetary System, has evolved over time and will continue to do so as fundamental business and political conditions underlying the world economy continue to shift. And you will see in the course of this lecture that it's precisely these business and political conditions that has caused the system to evolve over time. Right, so there are 5 main stages that we focus on here. The first stage is the bimetallism stage, which happened before 1876. And then we have the gold standard, the classical gold standard, that was pioneered in Britain, and then eventually got established over time. And then you have the interwar years, 1914 to 1944, which is a mixture of the gold standard and other things. And then you have the period of the Bretton Woods system, which is very famous, that established a fixed exchange rate system between the US dollar and gold. And then we eventually have a sort of a flexible exchange rate regime from 1973 until the present. So those ones with the star are examinable materials. Bimetallism. So what happened before 1876? Basically, all of the the payment systems in the world depended on either gold or silver in the major trading countries. So what do we do with the gold and the silver? But the governments actually would make them into coins. And then what happens is that you will have some countries that will have an exchange ratio between gold and silver based on the content of gold and silver. So each country will issue coins in gold or silver, and then they would agree, one country and the other country will agree that your gold coin is going to exchange for how many of my gold coin, and your silver coin is going to exchange for how many of my silver coins, and vice versa, depending on the actual content of gold and silver in the coins. Because each country will have different ways of making a gold and silver coin, and the content of the gold and silver coins are going to be very different. So, for example, I like to think about the 50 cents piece in Australia. It's the biggest piece in the Australian coin, right? So if we take the 50 cents coin back into the ancient times, and if it is made in silver, then it should be worth more than 50 cents in the ancient times, because it's just the bigger piece in silver, right? Whereas it should be worth more than probably even the other ones that you can see. Okay. Examples. So in the British pound, it relied on the gold standard. And then in the French franc, it was on a bimetallic standard. So in other words, they used both silver and gold to make their coinage. And the foreign exchange rate, as we said, are determined by the gold content, because in here, the common coinage is gold. So the British has gold, the French has gold, so the foreign exchange rate is determined by the gold content in their coin. And then we have the German mark, which relied on the silver standard, so they used silver coins. And then we had the French franc, which is, again, on the bimetallic standard. So the exchange rate would be fixed by the content of what? Silver, right? Because that is the common metal between the two countries. And then if we have the British pound versus the German mark, so we have the British pound that is based on the gold standard, and the German mark is based on the silver standard. Now we want to find the exchange rate between the British pound and the German franc. What do we do? We're going to use the cross rate, right? So it's just the same as in the cases where we have all the majors against the US dollar. In this case, we have a common currency that exchanges between Britain and Germany quite well. In this case, the French franc. So we can get a cross rate via the French franc. How do we do it? I thought I had an example. Okay, maybe that's not important. Okay, so basically what you're going to do is to convert the British pound into French franc first based on the gold content, and then you're going to get some amount of French franc that you are going to convert into German mark based on the silver content. So this is very much like the cross rate example that we just did. So in this case, we're going to convert pound into franc into mark, where the franc is the intermediary, just like the US dollar cross rate computation we just did. And this system was pretty unstable due to wars and political upheavals, because these systems relied on the supply of gold and silver. And they also assumed that the supply of gold and silver can be easily moved across different countries. So then, whenever we have wars and political upheavals, we will have a stop or embargoes on the movement of gold and silver across different countries. And then that made this system unstable. And so that's what ended the bimetallism. And that's when we started with the classical gold standard that England has always used and is now popularized into the rest of the country. So they thought that a more formalized system for setting the exchange rates are really important. And so with this new system, we needed a new rules of the game. So what are the rules of the game? Well, it says the amount of gold that each country holds determines the wealth of the country, because all of the coins are basically made out of gold, right? So basically you have a pile of gold, and you're going to make them into different coins, and the more coins that you have, the more rich you are. And if you have more coins, what does that mean? That means your money supply increases if you have more gold, right? So we have gold and money supply being sort of on a fixed proportion here. Each country sets a fixed rate at which its currency unit, paper or coin, could be converted to a given weight in gold. So even if you have paper money, the paper money is going to promise that this paper money is going to be able to give you, for you to redeem into a certain weight of gold. So gold is always the backing for every piece of currency, whether it is gold coin or paper money. So for example, in this case, we have US here that fixes 1 ounce of gold to be worth 20.67 US dollars. And then we have Britain here that says 1 ounce of gold is going to be worth 4.2474 pounds. So how do we set the FX exchange rate? The commonality is per ounce of gold here. We're trying to look for what is the purchasing power in gold. So we're going to do the cross rate in terms of the gold. Right? So that's why I emphasize so much in the first hour how to compute the cross rate, because everything following this is going to rely on the same concept. So in this case, we're trying to work out how much it's 1 pound worth in terms of US dollars. And so we're going to take the fixed exchange rate between the US dollar versus 1 ounce of gold over the fixed exchange rate between 1 pound and between 1 ounce of gold and pound. And that's what we get. 1 pound is worth 4.8665 US dollars. Any questions? Okay, so the other rule of the game is that gold should be moved freely across different countries in order to correct any misalignment in the foreign exchange rate. So what does that mean? Let's take a look at this example. So in this example, what we see here is that we see some exchange rates. So in this case, we have 1 ounce of gold in the US is going to be worth $20.67. 1 ounce of gold in the UK is going to be worth 4.2474. However, somewhere when you go to somewhere on the harbor on the FX exchange, you actually see a quote that's willing to give you $5 per pound. But if we worked out the theoretical exchange rate based on these two, what we should get instead is 4.8665. So that you get from doing this. Is there a profit-making opportunity to be made? Yes. So what we're doing is going to be the typical rule of buy low, sell high, right? So in this case, relative to the theoretical rate, what does it say about the value of the US dollar relative to the British pound? Is it overvalued or undervalued? It's undervalued. So let me make the reference clear. So relative to the theoretical rate against the gold, is this rate overvalued or undervalued in terms of the US dollar? Now that's an interesting point. So in the marketplace, for every pound, you have to pay $5. But if you actually just went through the gold, you should be paying 4.86. So the pound is overvalued, and analogously, the US dollar is undervalued. Because in the marketplace, you are having to pay more US dollars per pound, right? Because, okay, let's get back to this. This is very important. Okay, so if you went through trading in the gold system, what you get is that you effectively should get or should pay 4.8665 per pound. But you go to some corner shop, and this corner shop is willing to take 1 pound and pay you $5 or ask you to pay $5 per pound. So compared to the correct rate, is the US dollar overvalued or undervalued? It's too cheap or too expensive? It's too cheap, right? So we all agree that the US dollar is too cheap in the corner shop. So that means it's undervalued. Yeah? Great. Very good. Okay. So in this case, basically we have the dollar undervalued, and analogously the pound is overvalued. So we're going to correct this. How do we do it? Buy low, sell high. Okay, so suppose we start with 1,000 pounds. What should we do in order to benefit or profit from this market misprice? What do we do here? So we're going to sell, precisely, we're going to sell the pound in the foreign exchange market at the corner shop to get the higher value in terms of the US dollar, which you get $5 per pound. So you're going to get 5,000. And then what's the next step? Right. So the second step is that we're going to use the US dollar and buy gold. Right? So how much gold can we buy? We have 5,000 US dollars, and we know that each ounce of gold costs 20.67 US dollars. So we can get 241.9 ounces of gold. What's the third step? So now we have the gold in our hands. What do we do with the gold now to realize our profit? Buy the pounds back, right? So we buy the pounds back at the fixed exchange rate, which is 4.2474 pounds per ounce. So we're going to end up with 1,027.643 pounds. So we started with this much pound. We ended up with this much pound. So we can go on and conclude to say that we have made a riskless profit, but under what assumption? Right, 0 transaction cost, right? Because we're talking about moving gold between the UK and the US. It's a pretty long journey, right? Who knows that somebody might rob you of your gold somewhere. You might have to hire people to look after the gold, right? I would be really anxious. So in this case, this is called a triangular arbitrage. And this is a riskless profit or a riskless arbitrage opportunity only if they are able to transact or move the gold from place to place without, oops, what did I do? Without too much transaction cost. So in this case, if the transaction cost per 1,000 pound sales of the British pound does not exceed this amount, you're going to get some profit. And the more pounds that you have, the more you will get in terms of the profit. So what happens is that everyone in the class will know about this, and everyone in the class will jump into the market and sell their holdings in British pound, right? And to buy gold and to get US dollar converted back into British pound. And this is going to cause the pound to be worth less than the US dollar. And so then the market price is going to come back up. Come back down from $5. And the pound would depreciate because remember we said that pound was overvalued and the dollar is undervalued. So the pound is going to depreciate against the US dollar, and then this arbitrage that we did here will drive the process such that the calculated cross rate that we get equals the observed quotation. So this is the theoretical rate that we were talking about before. Okay, all good? Great. And we're going to have more examples of triangular arbitrage in topic 5. Okay, so the classical gold standard had some advantages that we are still thinking about them today. And in fact, if you think about Bitcoins, lots of people liked Bitcoins because it resembled the system, right? You only had a limited amount of Bitcoins that you can mine. And eventually, once everything has been mined, then you have a system that's pretty much similar to the gold standard system. And that is because of these following advantages. In this case, everything is fixed. Each country has a fixed exchange rate between the gold and its own currency. So you have a very stable foreign exchange rate. And for international trade and investment, this is a great thing. Because when we were talking about the challenges that firms have when they go global, the FX rate volatility was a problem, right? But in this case, volatility of exchange rate is not a problem. Everything is fixed. And when you have a currency that is backed by gold at any fixed rate, a country can only increase its money supply when its official authorities get more gold. So in current terms, what it means is that they have more monetary discipline. What does that mean? Nowadays, when you don't have as much gold, you can still increase your money supply. How do you do that? Print money, right? So that's what all the quantitative easing policies that each country is carrying out. They basically print more money. The US has went through several rounds of that. And what does printing money make? Inflation. What does inflation do to our purchasing power? Decrease our purchasing power, right? So that is one of the arguments for keeping the gold standard, because it imposes monetary discipline on the central banks and governments, because they can only have so much gold, and that's their entire money supply. They can't print more money at will. And in this case, also, no country may have a persistent trade deficit or surplus. What does that mean? That will lead into our next subtopic of the balance of trade. Under this system, the balance of trade or current account surplus, current account deficit that is so talked about in the trade war discussions will not be a problem here, because we're going to have no persistent trade account deficit or surplus. So why is that the case? Let's take a look at an example. Okay, suppose in this system, the UK, for whatever reason, has lower price levels than the French on some good. So the UK exports more to France than it imports from France. So in this case, what happens is that the Great Britain actually has a trade surplus, whereas France experiences a trade deficit. But in order for the French to buy more, what do they have to do? The French is now buying more than it's selling to the British. What does it have to do? If we buy online, or if we go into the supermarket to buy things, what do we have to do in order to take our purchases out? Pay, right? We have to pay. Pay your debt. So now, in this case, the French is importing more from the UK. So net, it has to pay the British. Right? They're not canceling out. They have to pay the British. They have to pay. And for the British, they're receiving payment. So in order to pay, under a gold standard system, that means that there is an outflow of gold from French to the UK. Now, Great Britain obtains more gold. And remember, we say that more gold means more money supply. They can make more gold coins. They can issue more money that is backed by gold. So when money supply increases, what happens to the price level in Britain? Increases, right? That's always the case. You have more money flowing in the economy, then people are going to demand more price for the same good. So there's going to be inflation. So now, British goods are more expensive relative to before. If you are the French, you see the item that you want to buy from Britain now is more expensive. Are you going to continue to demand the same amount? No, because it's now more expensive, right? So what happens is that it's going to slow down the exports from Britain to France. And now the French items are going to appear more attractive to the British. Right? So now export from Britain is going to drop, where export from the French are going to increase. Yeah? Very good. And then the next export position that was non-zero before is going to come back and disappear. So this is going to be neutralized. Sorry. Is going to be neutralized. Sorry for a really crappy handwriting here. I'm trying to not touch the screen. So this adjustment system is going to be referred to as the price specie flow mechanism. Something that you will need to know what it is. So what is it? Whoa, okay. So this is an idea or a theory that was advanced by David Hume. an economist, a Scottish economist in the 18th century. So what it says is that trade imbalances are temporary only, because under the gold standard, one country's price level is going to be offset by the counteracting flow of specie, which are gold coins or silver coins. It's going to equalize the prices between trading partners, such that balance of trade is going to come back to zero. All right? So basically what you have here is a system where under the gold standard, if price levels are out of equilibrium, and one country's export is bigger than another country, in this case UK. So export, this is import. Then what happens? It happens that gold in UK would increase. And because the money supply is fully dependent on the amount of gold, the money supply in UK would increase. So the price level in the UK will also increase. So in this case, exports from the UK is no longer as attractive. Analogously, gold in France is going to decrease at the same time. Money supply in France is going to reduce. Price levels in France also drop. So now export from the French is more attractive. Right? So then you have a counteracting force on the price levels, and that leads to counteracting changes in the exports and the imports. And so this is going to continue . So this is going to continue until the balance of trade goes to zero for all trading partners. So essentially, I'm going to upload this onto Wallow after class, so don't worry about that. But essentially, I just did what the Word version in the previous slide here in more simplified version. And that also reminds me to assure you that if we are in a final exam, if you are able to write in this term and make it really clear, in point form, I would highly encourage that, instead of writing in full sentences. We're not doing an English test here. Okay, so as long as you make yourself fully understandable, I think the point form is the way to go. It makes it really clear and really easy, because the feedback from all the students is that you have to write you have to write a bit, and so don't write an essay on this. Okay? Yes, you had a question. Right.
So in our current situation, they print money, but the argument is there's real growth rather than just inflation. But in this case, the countries have to go gold mining to increase the supply of gold to support the size of the economy.
Right.
And real growth.
Yes. So let me talk about this again, because this is very good and it leads very well into what I'm going to talk about next. So the idea here is that under this system, yes, we see all the advantages, right? It's clear. We have a fixed exchange rate. There's very little volatility. All the trade can go on. However, the amount of gold is very limited for each government. And so if one government wants to buy more products from another country, like what we do right now, we have huge demand for technology, for services and goods from other countries. And if we continue to go with this system, then we're very limited. And so our ability to grow as an economy is going to be limited by the amount of gold there exists on the earth. And actually, that's going to create a gold rush for the governments, right? So that is why, even though there are advantages to this system, for the reason of real growth and also for other reasons, this system is no longer what we have right now. What we have is something a little bit more. So in this case, just as Jim mentioned, right? In this case, the supply of newly minted gold is so restricted that the growth of world trade and investment can be seriously hampered by the supply of gold and the production of gold coins. So it's going to cause deflationary pressures. And if we had this system in the past decades, we will not have the economy as we have nowadays. So there is the deflationary pressures. And then also, you will have potential violations of the rules of the game by each government. Because right now, what we said is that in each government, they are going to say, we have a fixed price, right? For the Britain, gold is going to be about 4 pounds per ounce. And in the US, gold is about $20 per ounce. But who is to say that the US continues to abide by their rules and continue to have $20 per ounce, but not to have $100 per ounce, right? So then in this case, any national government can abandon the gold standard, and then this entire system is going to collapse. And that is exactly how the system collapsed. It's because of all the war years, right? So each country are running into problems. For all of the countries that were involved in the World War I and the World War IIs, they suspended redemption of banknotes in terms of gold, and they had embargoes on gold imports and export. Because they were really careful about if they exported gold to other countries, they are not going to be able to get it back. So there is a really important sense of trust in the system. Once one player no longer play by the rules, every other player will not play by the rules. So this system collapsed. So then, at that point, economic nationalism, I'm not sure if this term rings very familiar to you right now, because that's what we have right now, economic nationalism for each country, and the lack of cooperation between each country. Exchange rates fluctuated as countries widely used predatory depreciations of their currencies as a means of gaining advantage in the world export system. So in this case, if we say that there is predatory depreciations of currencies, and like the example that I used with the US dollar, so if they're trying to depreciate their currency, instead of the $20 per ounce, what should they set? Should they have higher conversion rate or lower conversion rate in order to depreciate their currency, to get more dollars per pound, per ounce of gold? So in this case, let me repeat the question again. So for the US, suppose they're running into problems in paying their fees. Instead of sticking to $20 per ounce of gold, in order to issue more currency and be able to pay their purchases, would they be wanting to have $50 per ounce or $10 per ounce? So the question here is the gold supply is fixed, but they want more money. Do they want a higher rate or do they want a lower rate? They want a higher rate. But now, the ounce of gold, for every dollar, they can only purchase less gold, right? So this is predatory deflation, or predatory depreciation. Yes or no? So the supply of gold is fixed. So that's the gold mountain here. All right, so that's the gold mountain here. The US is under a lot of pressure to pay. But it cannot have more gold. So it's going to issue more paper money in order to have the paper money to pay for purchases. Right? So it's going to unilaterally trying to increase their exchange rate per ounce of gold to increase the ability of themselves to print money. So basically then all of the countries may want to do something like this, and then the whole fixed exchange rate system is out of whack. But it's very difficult, so it is very difficult politically for the countries to follow the rules of the game because they want to act in the best interest of their own country. And so when cases are like this, we do not have coordination, and so this game collapsed. So what we have during the war years is tremendous instability, and then we have economic breakdown. In other words, the Great Depression that we have seen in the world in 1929 to 1939. And many major trading currencies lost their convertibility into other currencies, but the US dollar was one of the few exceptions. So then, what happened is what we have in terms of the introduction of fiat money. So fiat money is money that exists in place because of a government's order. The government establishes a decree that says, the paper money that I issue now to you shall be legal tender. It's not going to be backed by gold, but it shall be accepted as a means of payment. So if you actually look at an old American dollar versus a new American dollar nowadays, so in the old American dollar, what it says at the very bottom here is that $1 is it's in silver payable to the bearer on demand. So it's actually backed by silver. Whereas the new US dollar nowadays says, "In God we trust." All right, so basically you have now paper money or fiat money that we use nowadays, Australian dollar, US dollar, or any other dollar. We trust in the God and in governments that they're going to honor the payment. $1 today is going to be $1 tomorrow as well. Whereas before, we had silver or gold to back it up. We have actual good to back it up. So that is something that was quite important to what is in our wallets and purses nowadays. And then the system got so volatile that, okay, all the countries agreed that if we continue to like this, it's not going to work. So then what happened is that in 1944, 44 nations came together in New Hampshire in the US to attend what is called the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. So it is now commonly referred to as the Bretton Woods Monetary Conference. And they tried to design and discuss what should happen to the international monetary system in the post-war period. So it's somewhere in near Boston. It's somewhere near Boston here, and it's called the Mount Washington Hotel. So there are several outcomes. So now the first outcome is that they want to go back to somewhat of a gold standard, but the only country with a lot of gold at that time is the US. So they're going to take, I guess, just a in-between agreement where you will have a dollar-based gold exchange system where the US, the Federal Reserve System, so the Fed stands for the Federal Reserve System, the Central Bank of the United States, which is at the bottom here, will issue US dollars. And they're going to fix the convertibility of US dollars to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. And then for all the other central banks, countries A, B, and C, they're going to convert their amount of foreign currency to the US dollar at a certain rate. Par value is the face value, right? So that is what they have decided. And then all these different countries will have their foreign exchange be calculated as cross-exchange rates. So this is how we see nowadays where everything goes through the US dollar that came from the Bretton Woods system. So everything is anchored through the US dollar since then. And the other outcome from this discussion is the International Monetary Fund, because a lot of countries are running into problems. And this fund is supposed to provide temporary financial assistance to member countries if they run into problems. And we also have the World Bank, which used to be called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is a mouthful. And it is headquartered in Washington, D.C., which also helps to finance member countries' infrastructure expenses to help them to grow. So there are certain mandates for these organizations. And so here, I would like to take you to a short video on the Bretton Woods system.
After World War II, it was clear the world needed a new financial system. The gold standard was considered too rigid, but at the same time, economists were worried that countries would devalue their currency to boost exports. For this reason, 44 countries sent delegates to a conference held in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, as of the 1st of July, 1944. The U.S., which held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves after the war, was obviously the most influential player, and ultimately, all currencies ended up linked to the dollar, and the dollar was linked to gold. One important concern arose, though. If a country goes through an economic crisis, how can it get out of it without devaluing its currency? To address this issue, two institutions were created. One, the International Monetary Fund, which was supposed to lend money to countries that are in trouble and cannot attract financing from other sources. Two, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is now called the World Bank and was supposed to help less developed countries grow. Unfortunately, as good as it may have sounded on paper, the Bretton Woods system didn't survive because the United States kept running deficits to fund various projects, and therefore, the amount of dollars in existence kept increasing while the gold reserves of the U.S. kept shrinking, as more countries demanded gold in exchange for their dollars. As such, on the 15th of August 1971, Nixon officially announced that dollars would no longer be convertible to gold, thereby putting the final nail in the coffin of the Bretton Woods system.
All right, so this is a really good short video because it goes directly into my next point here of the demise of the Bretton Woods system.
Everybody thinks the U.S. dollar is still as good as gold, and it hasn't been since 1971. This is the world monetary system.
I highly recommend these documentaries. They're very fascinating. Okay. So basically what lends to the demise of the Bretton Woods system is essentially what we were discussing in class. Again, it is the limited supply of gold and the reliance on the US dollar. So basically the US had to keep printing money in order to make sure that the rest of the world has enough reserve to run and maintain their trading systems. And then the Vietnam War happened, and a lot of social programs in the U.S. also created a lot of purchasing expenditures for the U.S. And so the U.S. dollar is no longer very credible in terms of its convertibility into gold. And so other countries started to distrust the US dollar, and so if they do not trust the US dollar, they no longer hold on to the US dollar. And remember here, in the Bretton Woods system, we fixed US dollar to $35 per ounce of gold, right? So if other countries stopped holding US dollars, they wanted gold in return. So then that means that the US had to give lots of other countries a lot of gold, and it no longer has as much gold reserve. And so basically the whole thing led to the creation of the special drawing rights, which I'll ask you to read on your own. Basically then at the end of it, Nixon, as you saw on the video, announced that they're going to terminate the convertibility of the US dollar into the gold. And then that ends the entire gold system because there is not enough gold to support this. And then we have the special drawing rights, which then I will ask you to read on your own. This is something that's created and used a lot in the International Monetary Fund, which is essentially a basket of different major currencies that allow member countries to have fixed amount of foreign currency and to finance their purchases. And China, the Chinese yuan, was added to the special drawing right mix in 2016, October, where before it was just the US dollar, the euro, Japanese yen, and Great British pound. But again, there are lots of material on the special drawing rights. I'm not going to spend too much time on that here. So that's excerpt from the IMF. Okay, so after Nixon announced in 1976 that the Bretton Woods system, or the convertibility of US dollar into gold, stopped, we entered into what we have nowadays. essentially we term it as the flexible exchange rate regime. So this is a sort of a combination of different exchange rates regimes that different countries and governments employ nowadays. Either fixed or pegged or floating or dollarization. So if we have a floating system, then this is mainly a market-driven system by supply and demand. Or if we have a fixed system, we have the currency of a country that is pegged to the value of some other country. And then under floating, we will have a free floating, so a completely free floating currency, or a managed float. So the currency is allowed to float between a band. And then under fixed exchange rate system, we have a soft peg and a hard peg. So nowadays, the terminology between managed float and the soft peg are a little bit intermixed because basically you can fluctuate across a certain band. But the key idea here is that we do not have a true free floating system. What we have instead is a dirty float, what they call dirty float in the foreign exchange market. So essentially, the government will intervene in the foreign exchange market from time to time if they think that the currency is depreciating too much or appreciating too much. And why would governments want to do that? Why would governments want to intervene in the financial markets nowadays if they think that their currency is appreciating too much? Huh? Stabilize the economy, but why is intervention a good stabilization? If the currency of your country is appreciating too much, what does that do to the economy? Exports, right? It hurts your export. So if the government cares about the voters and what they feel about how well you're managing the economy, then they are going to step in and ask the central bank to intervene in the foreign exchange market to make sure the currency doesn't appreciate overly much. And then it's the other way around, when it's depreciating too much. So most of every country in the world right now fluctuates between a dirty float to a hard peg. But it's always nice to talk about the free floating system because that's the benchmark and that's the ideal for each country, apparently. But let's see whether or not that is good. So we will be looking at all of these four forces. What happens to a country if there is extreme inflation? What happens to domestic production? What happens when there is unemployment? Or what happens to the imports and exports? So let's take a look at an example here. So we have the US and the UK each under a free floating regime. So suppose in this case we start with the scenario that the price levels in the US is higher than the price levels in the UK. So what happens? So in this case, for the US consumers, all the goods in the UK are going to be more cheap, relatively cheaper. And so they are going to want to buy more goods from the British. And for the British, the goods from the US is going to appear more expensive relative to their own goods. So they are going to reduce on importing. Right? So this is a very good example. Like when I was in Canada, the price levels in Canada is about 20% higher than the US. And Toronto is sort of very close to the US, to New York, to Buffalo City. So then a lot of Torontonians on long weekends would drive and go across the bridge and buy and fill up their petrol in the US and then come back. And then I used to think that Canada was expensive. Oh, wait until you come to Australia. Everything was 20% more expensive than in Toronto. And then I started to really appreciate how lucky I was. But anyway, so that's all the different price levels. And you really see these price levels and trading happen in real life. So then what happens? The increase in demand for British goods is going to drive up the demand for British pound. Why is that the case? Why does this... Why does the increase in demand for British goods lead to an increase in demand for British pounds? Yes. Right? Because the US needs to pay the British in pounds. So basically then the US would need to demand more British pounds in the market. And that is going to also set a reduction in demand for American goods, because now American goods are more expensive than the goods in the UK. So the British are not going to demand as much. So that's going to lead to a supply of British pounds. So the demand for British pounds is going to increase, and the supply of British pounds is going to decrease because the UK doesn't participate in the international trade as much now. Right? Because if they participated in international trade and bought from the US, they are going to exchange their British pound for US dollars to pay. So that is why we say that the supply of British pound has reduced, because the UK is no longer buying from the US. Yeah? Okay. So the British pound is going to appreciate against the US dollars, because there is an increase in demand and decrease in supply of the British pound. The British goods now becomes more expensive for US customers, but the actual prices in the UK has not changed. But the British goods just appears to be more expensive for US customers. So now the British pound has appreciated. So the UK consumers will continue to buy US goods in spite of higher US prices, because for them, now the US goods appear to be really expensive, to be cheaper now. And so now they can exchange more pounds for the US dollar. Right? So now you see that because of the appreciation of the pound, the purchasing power of the pound has increased. The purchasing power of the pound for US goods has increased. Right? So they are going to be able to afford to buy more from the US. Yes? Is there a point that I can clarify a bit more? Yes? No? It's clear, or? Yes? Right. So under the free floating rate, that's going to be the case. Because what we have is that the price level in the UK did not change. But for the US customers, now the goods in UK has become more expensive. So they're not going to buy as more relative to before from the UK, just because the purchasing power of the US dollar has decreased. Yeah, that was prior to this. Yes. And now, because of the change in the purchasing power of the British pound, it has appreciated relative to the US dollar, right? Now, for the for the UK customers, their purchasing power of US goods has increased because US goods has become relatively cheaper for them, right? The price in the US at this moment hasn't changed. It's only the exchange rate, purchasing power has changed. But money supply has not changed at this point, right? The inflation was at the beginning what set off everything. But relative to the higher price level at the point, at the beginning, there has no other effect. It's just one price increase. And then we assume everything is fixed at the point. Ceteris paribus. So in all of your economic analysis, there's that one change at the beginning, and then we assume that it's fixed. Right? In the beginning, there's higher price levels in the US. Not trade surplus. Oh, well, okay. Trade surplus as in that the US...
Because UK, right, the price, the Americans like to buy British goods in the beginning because the inflation rates are not equal because in America price level is higher.
Right, so at the beginning, the American price levels are higher, so the Americans want to buy more from the British. And so there is trade surplus on the British side. Yes.
Reach equilibrium, then the British doesn't have, the UK doesn't have the trade surplus anymore, so it's equal and the exchange rate stabilizes.
Yes. So, but you're jumping a little bit ahead. So basically, then what happens when there is a trade surplus? Now the British is selling more to the US, so there's more demand for the British pound, and the British is not buying as much from the US, so there is a reduction in the supply of pound. So both of these act to appreciate the pound's value against the US dollar, right? So that is step one. And then step two, what you said is the equilibrium is about step 5. Yes, because we're talking about instantaneous adjustments and then eventual adjustments. Right? So here we're just talking about instantaneous adjustments. So right now, we have the British pound appreciating relative to the US dollar. And so for the British, their purchasing power in terms of their pound for the US good has increased. Right? Instantaneously. So then they want to purchase more US goods. Right? So that's where we are at this point. And so they're going to do that. So that's the that is the instantaneous or medium-term reactions. And then Jim actually mentioned to the long-term effect of how now you see all of this, then you would eventually expect the prices to adjust backward into equilibrium, right? But in this case, what we have is that the UK consumers will continue to purchase US goods in spite of higher US prices because they can exchange more pounds into the US dollar. And it stopped here. But then, in the long run, what happened is in the same case as in the gold standard case that we saw before, eventually then the trade surplus is going to come down. and then we will have the effect here. But right now, we are just looking at the instantaneous or the medium-term reactions. All right? Just the immediate impact on the US dollar and the US inflation. Next, suppose the US experiences a reduction in employment. So basically, they have unemployment or heightened unemployment. What happens? So their income might drop. The US consumers would reduce the demand for the UK goods. And so that is going to reduce the immediate demand for British pounds because they don't have to pay the UK for their imports. This places a downward pressure for the pound, and the pound is going to depreciate. And in return, the British goods become cheaper for US customers, offsetting prior reduction in demand due to lower US income from unemployment. So again, this is the immediate and medium-term impact. So for a country with a free floating regime, it is more insulated from inflation and unemployment from other countries because in this case, Britain is insulated from the problems of inflation and unemployment from the US. However, let's get back to the US. So again, we have the case here where the price levels in the US is higher than the UK at the beginning. So now this is a one-time price disturbance. This sets off everything that we see in motion later. So the US consumers are going to buy more goods from the UK, the same as we saw before, and the British will reduce importing US goods, as we saw before. The increase in demand for British goods leads to an increase in supply of the US dollar, right? They're going to supply US dollar and demand pound, right? So we had an increase in demand for pound in the previous slide. And the reduction in demand for American goods leads to a reduction in demand for the US dollar. And in the previous case, we talked about decrease in supply of pound. So there are both two sides of the same coin. So in here, we talk about the US dollar depreciate against the British pound. Before we talk about the British pound appreciate against the US dollar. So they're the same thing, right? Raw materials and supplies from the UK may increase in price, which further increases the price of produced goods in the US. So now we're talking about step 3. And US producers may recognize the competition from their UK competitors because of the weaker US dollar. So now they recognize that the US purchasing power of UK goods is lower. So for US producers who are competing for US customers, because of the weaker US dollar, US customers are not as likely to buy from the UK. So for the US, they could potentially increase the price levels and pass this on to their consumers because they're simply not going to buy from the UK competitors. And so in this case, in the long term, potentially, you started with inflation, higher price level in the US, and then this is going to lead even higher prices in the US. So this now we're talking about the long-term effect. Yes? Yes? Okay. Oh, so suppose that your productions might increase in, so suppose you are making materials in the US and you're importing raw materials from the UK, right? So now, because of the weaker US dollar, the prices that you're getting is going to increase your production cost. So then your production cost increases, and so this is going to increase the production cost in the US accordingly. So then for the manufacturer who is facing this higher cost, what can it do? It could either bear the cost itself, or it can increase the price. And, right, exactly. So then looking at this choice, then I look, okay, if I increase the price, are my customers going to go away to a competitor? But in this case, because of the weaker US dollar, my customers are not going to buy from the UK because they simply just cannot afford it. So I can just increase the price by a little bit to pass on the increased production cost to my customers. And they're still going to buy from me. And so in this case, the price increase, the price level has even further increased more, exacerbated. So that sort of answers your question. Because your question is about what happens to the price level, right? So in the price level question here, at the beginning we start with one temporary disturbance to the price level, a higher price level at the beginning that sets off everything here. And now we're talking about another increase in the price level. So you started with high inflation in the US, you ended up with even worse inflation in the US under the free floating system. All right? Okay, I'm getting nods here. Any questions? This is the time to get it. Okay, some time to digest. I'm in my office tomorrow, and there's the Waddle Forum. All right, so so think about this, digest it, and make sure that we get it. Great. All right, so let's look at the case for the US when it experiences a reduction in employment, as we said before. So previously, we were looking at a perspective from the UK, and here we are looking from the perspective of the US. So in this case, US consumers will reduce their demand for UK goods, which leads to a reduction in supply of the US dollar, and US dollar will appreciate, which is the same as before. British goods become cheaper for the US customers, all right? So this is going to further depress the demand from the US domestic goods and may prolong unemployment. So for the UK, if its trading partner and itself both have a free exchange rate system, then if the trading partner has problems in terms of high inflation or unemployment, the UK is insulated. So that's what the previous two examples are about. The intermediate effect for the UK, right? So for the slides, for the slides 45 as well as 46, these are the impact on UK. Whereas for the next two slides, these are the impacts for the US. If you had problems to begin with, you are going to have a worse problem, potentially, that's under this free exchange rate system. Okay, so like in this case, the U.S. started with unemployment, higher unemployment, and then they're going to their actions are going to cause the U.S. dollar to appreciate under the free exchange rate system, such that the British goods now appears to be more cheap relative to the U.S. goods, and so the U.S. consumers are going to buy more UK goods. And because they're buying more UK goods, there's less demand for their own domestic production. And if there's less demand for their own domestic production, then that means there is continued unemployment for the US factories. All right, so take a moment to think about this, and then hopefully it's going to become very clear to you. But okay, just allow me to try to stab at this another time. Okay, so in this case, the U.S. experiences a reduction in unemployment. So if there is unemployment, then your overall income may reduce, right? Your overall income may reduce, so your purchasing power has reduced. Very good. So your purchasing power has reduced. You are going to demand less from your imports, right? Your purchasing power, you can't buy as much. And so you're going to decrease demand for import. And because you decrease your demand for import, what you eventually do is to reduce supply of US dollars. So by the laws of supply and demand, if you have less supply of something, the price of that thing is going to increase, right? So by demanding less import, what you essentially do is to make your dollar stronger. So US dollar now is more expensive or stronger. So then that means your purchasing power relative to the British pound has increased. And if it increases to a level such that the domestic US goods are going to be more expensive, then you're going to buy more of the British goods. UK goods may be cheaper now. Okay? So the UK goods may be relatively cheaper, and so you are going to buy more UK goods. And that is going to be bad for the domestic economy because you're not demanding from the domestic economy. Yes, question. Yes, yes. So Jim mentioned that in this case, if the government cares about domestic economy, what it should do is to dump U.S. assets by precisely. You can increase interest rates or whatever, decrease interest rates to cause people to do not want to demand as much U.S. dollar, to bring the price of U.S. dollar back down, right? But that is government intervention, right? So that is the difference here. Governments can have no role in the free floating system. So the government can only see all of this happening. And so this unemployment problem is going to be worsened under the free floating system because the government simply have no power to come in and do it. And you can see how strong the incentive is for it to come in. That is why there is no free floating system in the world, because no government can stand there and allow this to happen. They're not going to be a government tomorrow because everybody is going to vote them down. So that is why this cannot happen in the real world, because no government is going to allow this to happen. Economy, U.S. economy in further trouble. All right, so hopefully this takes a bit more time to, oh dear, that's bad. Maybe you can back up a little bit to the Echo 360. So in conclusion, the free floating exchange rate system is not a really perfect monetary system that you will see, and that is why you actually do not see it in the real world. Because every government has a really strong incentive to go in there and rescue their economy. Okay, very good. And then we have the managed flow system. So these are the countries that advertise they have a band of some sort, where usually market forces will, of supply and demand is going to set the price range, but governments sometimes go in to intervene, just like the case that Jim suggested. If US dollar is appreciating in that situation, then it might want to come in and counteract the appreciating pressure. However, the criticism is that the regime allows the government to manipulate the foreign exchange rate to benefit its own country. But as I said, the incentives of every government is very clear. It is to act in the best interest of their economy. And then we have a soft tax system under fixed exchange rate. So then these exchange rates are either held constant or allowed to fluctuate only within a very narrow band. So the advantages of these systems are to insulate a country from the risk of currency appreciation, just as we have talked about. And it allows firms to engage in foreign direct investment without too much foreign exchange rate risk. However, the country may be more vulnerable to economic conditions in other countries and to speculative attacks. So why is a country under a managed flow system or even just a dirty flow system more vulnerable to speculative attacks? So basically what happens is we need to review a little bit about currency appreciation versus currency depreciation. So what is a currency depreciation? When a currency's value is changed in the open currency market by market forces, it is going to be called by depreciation or appreciation. But when there is government intervention, then we start to talk about revaluation and devaluation. So what does revaluation mean? When a government officially declares its own currency to be worth more relative to other currencies, then that is a revaluation. Or a devaluation is when a government officially declares its own currencies to be worth less relative to other currencies. So the terminology here is that whenever you see a valuation change, that is government intervention. Whereas if you see appreciation and depreciation, that comes from market forces of supply and demand. And we're going to talk about those government interventions in topic 3. So when a country cannot sustain its current fixed exchange rate, the central bank can reset the rate by devaluing the currency against other currencies. So that has been done. And a really famous person in foreign exchange history is George Soros. Anyone who have heard of what he has done? Yes. The Thai baht, yes. What's your name? Hattie. Thank you. So, indeed, George Soros was the one who is sort of responsible, but in a lot of people's mind, for the Asian financial crisis in 1997 and 1998, because even though he isn't, because he was just capitalizing on the economic weakness in the Asian markets at that time, but what he did is he did attack the Thai baht, which at that time was pegged to the US dollar. And he attacked it such that he kept, so how does he attack it? He shorted the Thai baht. He made bets that it's going to drop in value. But then at the time, the Thai government wanted to maintain the peg to the US dollar. So what they did is they engaged in open market operations that we're going to talk next class to try to maintain the value of Thai baht. But the government failed. And so we had the crash of the Thai baht and a lot of Asian currencies in the Asian financial crisis. Right, that is one. He also fought against the Bank of England. Right? In 1992, he bet against the Bank of England on the value of pound, and he actually won. And he made 1 billion British pound from that bet. So he's almost like a legend in FX. And he also tried to attack the Hong Kong dollar during the Asian financial crisis. Who knows the outcome of that? He failed, right? So that brings us to the strength of currency boards and so on in the next few slides. So I strongly encourage you to read up on George Soros. I'm going to post some articles on him, and his manipulations in the foreign exchange market is very fascinating. And if you bet right, you can really get a lot of money. So we also have what's called a hard peg system, where a country will give up their own sovereignty over monetary policy, and they commit to replace their own currency with a foreign currency. So in this case, for example, we have Zimbabwe that replaced their own currency with the US dollar. So that's called dollarization. And we have a few African countries that sort of pegged to the euro or the Swiss franc. And then we have the currency board. So countries that had or is having a currency board include Argentina, Bulgaria, Denmark still have a currency board today, Estonia, the Hong Kong Special Administration region are the ones with a currency board. So currency boards are a special construct that's sort of different from a central bank, but their entire mandate is to make sure that countries' currency maintains in a value against this hard peg. So in this case, the legal requirement for the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, in this case, is to fix the value of the Hong Kong dollar to the US dollar. And the rate is for every US dollar, it can be converted into 8 Hong Kong dollars. And so in order to make sure they have a really strong system to maintain the value of the Hong Kong dollar, they have to hold a specified amount of foreign exchange reserve. So in this case, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority holds foreign reserves that's equal to 1/8 of the domestic money supply. And it is this very strong discipline that is practiced by the Hong Kong Monetary Board Authority that allowed it to survive the speculative attack from George Soros. whereas Argentina actually failed in 2002, and they just abandoned the peg. So in this case, this is an example of Denmark. So Denmark has a national bank, which is its currency board, and basically it states that it conducts a fixed exchange rate policy against the euro, and it's committed to doing everything possible in order to maintain that value. And so in this case, whenever you see economic weakness in that country, and you suspect that country doesn't have as much foreign currency or foreign reserves to maintain this peg, then you will have speculators coming in to start attacking the system. And governments may lose, as in the case of Bank of England. All right. Let's do a bit of a summary before we leave this class. So after what we have talked about, countries will not experience persistent trade deficit or surplus under which monetary system? So you can sort of see the side here, sorry. So the first one is bimetallism, B is gold standard, C is Bretton Woods, and D is the free floating exchange rate regime. Right? So far, I think that went down really well. So if you went back, we talked about at length about how persistent trade surplus and trade deficit would not happen under the gold standard system. But there is still trade surplus and trade deficits under the free floating system. So in this case, going with the majority is good. And you're playing with the other ones. All right, thank you very much. So we are going to talk about the balance of payments next class. So for this one, this is going to be pretty straightforward in terms of how you record balance of payments for transactions between countries. And balance of payments only come into importance because we are in the current exchange rate regime. Because this would not be important if we were under the gold standard, right? So all of the news article that you see about balance trade surplus, balance of trade deficit, that is talked about very often in the U.S.-China trade wars, that came into really big importance because of the new exchange rate regime that we have. But in the interest of time, I still have 10 more minutes. Can you just stick with me for a bit more? All right. So here, the demand and supply of currencies arises out of international trades and international capital flow. I'm going to try to go over as much as I could. And then that gives rise to the term of the balance of payments, which is the measurement of all international economic transactions that takes place between the residents of one country and foreign residents over a certain period in time. So this is a snapshot. It's not an equilibrium. And the measurement is double entry bookkeeping, credits and debits. And over a certain period of time, you see these records being computed or recorded every quarterly or every yearly. It is a cash flow statement, so it's a point-in-time statement, not a balance sheet. So for double entry bookkeeping from your other classes, we primarily care about the debit account or the credit account. So if you have inventory, increase in inventory is recorded as a debit, or if you have a accounts payable is recorded as a credit. So that's your accounting classes. So under the balance of payments, we care about mainly 3 separate accounts. First, the current account. So everything that concerns the trades in goods and services comes into the current account. Goods, services, income, current transfers. What are these? Goods, trades are transactions of exports and imports of goods. So if Australia exports iron to China, that goes into the current account. Service trade, transactions of export and import of services. For all of you that comes to Australia for education, it gets recorded as a export of education services on the Australian current account. For income, so these include all of the interest and dividend payments, earnings of firms and workers operating in foreign countries. And lastly, what's in this category are the unilateral international money transfers. So these include foreign aids, payments of foreign aids, payments of gifts, or payments of grants. So suppose you receive a grant from the International Monetary Fund, it gets recorded into Australia's current account. So this is the movement of Australia's current account and component balances over the past 8 years. So what do you notice here? Is it mainly in deficit or in surplus? So if it is in surplus overall, it should be above 0. So it's actually slightly in the deficit right now in terms of the current account. So that means what? That means it's actually importing more relative to its exports. And this is the case for US for the past 8 years. So that for the US is a bit more stable, but notice that the unit here is different. These are in terms of billions, whereas for the Australian balance of payments is in terms of millions. So the US has a much bigger economy and a much bigger balance of payment accounts. The other important account in balance of payment is the capital and financial account. That includes or records all of the foreign direct investments, portfolio investment, and other asset investments. So everything related to capital transfers. And we're going to ignore the difference between the capital account and the financial account for this purpose. There are some slight distinctions between the two, but in general, in this course, we're going to be using the capital account to refer to both of those. And then finally, we have the official reserves account, which is the total foreign exchange reserves plus domestic reserves that is held by official monetary authorities within a country. And so in this case, for Australia, it would be the Reserve Bank of Australia that is holding all of this. And the major currencies or the hard currencies that is held by a country in the official reserves account are how much they have in terms of US dollars, the euro, Japanese yen, gold, and the special drawing rights and so on. And they can be used very much to conduct the open market interventions that we are going to talk about in topic 3. All right, so do we have a debit or do we have a credit? So this slide is going to be very important, just like the bid prices and the ask prices of a quotation. So in the balance of payment, a credit adds to the balance sheet. So anything such as the export of goods and services, that records foreign exchange that you are going to get. It's recorded as a credit or a positive. So you're selling your foreign trading partners something. So this is going to be recorded as a credit event, and this implies an inflow of foreign exchange into the country. So this is definition that you need to remember. And by definition also, a debit account on the balance of payment is records of foreign exchange spent. So it's going to record your expenditures with your trading partners that you buy from your trading partners. And this represents an outflow of